Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this month's George Talk. Les Wilson is distinguished Scottish journalist, and one of the things that distinguishes Orwell from so many people who are ideologically driven was if he faced different circumstances, and therefore because he was not fitting his views to an ideology, if the facts changed, he changed his view. And Les is going to give us a talk on his book, which, among other things, illustrates that beautifully. Over to you, Les.
Well, good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, or whatever it is, wherever you are. I'm speaking from my kitchen on the island of Islay. I was in Port Ascog earlier today, seeing my daughters off to the mainland, but I could see the ferry going to Jura. It takes about 7 or 8 minutes to go from Islay to Jura, so I'm that close. Although once I got to Jura, there would be an awful long way to go up to Barn Hill. I thought that on this day, the 16th, I would start by just quoting Orwell's diaries from the 16th of June in 1946, overcast all day, raining pretty steadily from about 11:30 onwards. And then in the following year, he says, there may perhaps been a little rain in the night, mostly overcast, blowy and coldish, which just shows that some things just never change, because that's exactly how it's been on Islay today. I was on Jura last Saturday, not yesterday, the day before, at the sculptor Hans Clausen's exhibition, a collection of 1,984 copies of 1984. And it was called the Winston Smith Library of Victory and Truth. And these were all displayed in cabinets, and people walked around the cabinets, and they could be encouraged to take out books and open them and to examine them. And it was, you think, 1,984 copies of the same book. What interest is that? But it was fascinating because there was a lot of local people there. The community on Jura is actually growing slightly. It's about 240, 250 now, up in the last few years. There was also quite a lot of visitors, people who were staying there, people who were actually on boats at the marina there. And they wandered around this event, picking up books and examining them, because people had written why 1984 was important to them and how they got these copies. I mean, there was a battered first edition. There was an American first edition. There's a Hebrew translation next to an Arab translation. There was a Russian translation next to a Ukrainian translation. I picked up a familiar looking orange paperback, Penguin paperback, which I remembered from my youth. And it turned out to be Quentin Kopp's school edition. Penguin made them pretty rough, pretty good books in these days. But Quentin's edition was well thumbed, and it was quite a serendipitous moment to pick Quentin's book off the shelf. And it was a fascinating event. And it showed you that people were really energized. People on Jura were really energized by the whole idea of Orwell's stay on Jura writing 1984. Now, I'm 75 next month, and I first encountered Orwell, like many others did, at school with Animal Farm in 1984. But I was a fairly bookish child. It was easy to be bookish in these days. There only were 2 television channels. So once you'd seen Doctor Who and Top of the Pops, reading a book was the best thing you could do. And I read a wide range of Orwell. And I still have my copies from some copies from
The
Desert Island book, which was a cheat, because it's not a book, it's 4 books. It's the classic Penguin collected essays, letters, and journalism. And I read through that from cover to cover. Usually it was my reading last thing at night, so I could read an essay or a couple of letters or something like that. And it was only then that I began to get the hint that Orwell was really quite anti-Scottish. Then I read Bernard Crick's biography of Orwell, and I found there was quite a lot of anti-Scottishness in it. And I began to investigate a little bit further, particularly in the last few years, as to why he should be so anti-Scottish. And as a Scot, I put on a tartan shirt for this event as a proud Scot. There were books that just outlined Orwell's antipathy to Scots. So I began to look into this and try to understand why he dislikes Scots so much, why he came to the Inner Hebrides to write 1984, and how his view seemed to change when he was there. So I'll just I'm going to read just a little bit that explains why I began to write this book. Excuse me, I got a bit of a dry throat today. I'm using an Orwell trick of drinking lots of tea. This is actually Ceylon tea, not, as he would say, not the filthy Chinese stuff. The many friends who knew of Orwell's anti-Scottish prejudice could never have predicted that the dissident but patriotic Englishman would move to what he had dismissed as the land of burns, braes, kilts, sporrans, claymores, bagpipes, and the like. But Jura became the place where Orwell decided to put down roots. My own admiration for Orwell, along with curiosity about the roots of his long hostility to Scotchmen, as he deliberately called them to give offence, and a desire to understand the benign influence of Jura and its people on the brilliant but crotchety English author was the catalyst for this book. An English son of the empire and a product of his era and class, Orwell was not a man to keep his prejudices to himself. These were many and various. He frequently denigrated homosexuals, calling them Nancy boys and pansies, how he would have hated the appropriation of the word gay. All tobacconists are fascists, he proclaimed. Scratch the average pacifist, he wrote with contempt, and you'll find a jingo. He deplored English Catholics who he thought pro-fascist, and had a curious dislike of bearded fruit juice drinkers and people who wore sandals. He pilloried vegetarians, escaped Quakers and birth control fanatics, and other assorted cranks. And for most of his life, he nursed a loathing for Scotsmen. While many biographers and memoirs have mentioned Scott's curious prejudice against Scots, I believe that none until now have seriously explored the reasons for it, or how his relationship to Scotland swiftly evolved after moving to Jura. So as I looked and investigated, I found various strands of Orwell's life that actually put him on the road to anti-Scottishness. The first, of course, I suppose, is the fact that he had a Scottish name. The name Blair is a Celtic name. It's a Gaelic name. It means field, it could mean battlefield, but certainly it was one that he wanted to shed pretty quickly. And perhaps the reason was because he had this family history of slave ownership. And if you come back from the British Empire, from Burma, a committed anti-imperialist, having slave-owning antecedents is probably not, a great thought. It probably weighs fairly heavy on you. And then, of course, there was the prep school, which he describes in his essay, Such Were the Joys. And some authors have claimed that he overstated that, but others, Gavin Maxwell, there a decade later, so his mother had to take him away because he was so miserable there. So certainly it was a pretty horrible experience for Orwell. And of course, it was made horrible by the fact that a lot of Scottish landowners and aristocrats, toffs, sent their boys there. And Orwell, being on half these, had a chip on at least one shoulder. And I think that did not give him a very good impression of Scots. The next event in Orwell's life when he actually experienced Scots was in Burma in the police. Now, Burma is a curious case. If the Darien scheme, the Scotland's attempt to form a colony, which ended badly, caused a financial collapse in Scotland and caused eventually the Treaty of Union with England in 1707. Had that gone right, it would have probably looked a bit like Burma did in Orwell's time. much of the capitalist enterprise, imperialist enterprise in Burma was Scottish run. There was the Irrawaddy Flotilla, which ran 600 ships on the Burmese waterways, Glasgow-based company, using often Scottish-built ships and often crewed with Scottish skippers and engineers. There was oil. Burma Oil had been the main producer of oil for Britain during World War I. Again, another Glasgow-based company and stuffed with Scots. And then there was William McKinnon's ships. He was one of the greatest capitalists of his era. His ships served the routes to Burma. And once you got there, if you got on a train, it was almost certainly built in Glasgow. And then, of course, there was the teak industry as well. A lot of the planters were Scots. And of course, Scotland had a huge advantage coming into the empire when it did, because based on the philosophy of John Knox, that there should be a school in every parish so that everyone should be able to read the Bible for themselves, actually had a huge effect on Scottish education. And Scotland probably had the most literate population in Europe in the early 20th century. But of course, if you could read the Bible, as John Knox wanted you to do, you could also read Das Kapital or Practical Mechanics or all sorts of stuff. So it made Scots, it equipped Scots to do well in the Union and in the Empire. So what you got in Burma was large numbers of reasonably educated, working class, middle class Scots living the life of Riley. They lived like princes. It was a very, very low wage economy. They could have servants and mistresses and whatever they wanted. And some of this was really illustrated in Burmese days. There are a couple of Scottish characters. One is a man who refers to the natives as Dart, and another one is a Glasgow mechanic who is only interested in two things, whiskey and magnetos. Now, of course, you'd never ascribe the characters in a novel to actually the author's own views. But of course, if you couple this with accounts that appear in, for instance, in Bernard Crick's wonderful biography, then you can see that there really was a dislike of Scots, and it must have been certainly magnified by his time seeing the Scottish planters and oilmen and so on, and their behaviour in Burma. In the Whites Only Club in Burma, there's a wonderful incident in Burmese days when a young whippersnapper of an officer kicks a servant at a club he's visiting, and some old colonel reprimands him and says, it's not his job to kick the servants. They'll kick their own servants, thank you very much. So I think that the imperial Scots were not people that Orwell warmed to. And then, of course, there's a missed opportunity to actually overcome this prejudice, and that missed opportunity was the Spanish Civil War. I've always been interested in the Spanish Civil War. My father was a member of the ILP, which was, of course, allied to the POUM. My father wanted to, but he was only 13 at the time, and his mother wouldn't let him go. But he always retained a strong interest, and one of his favorite books was Homage to Catalonia. But had Orwell had not joined the POUM, had he joined the International Brigade, he would have met very different comrades.
10 past 7, something like that. Yeah.
There was 2,400 Brits in the British brigadistas in Spain, and a quarter of them were Scots, way out of proportion to the population of Scotland. There was a few intellectuals, but mostly there were Communist Party members, ILP members, Labour Party members, trade unionists. There were working class people. I was fortunate enough to know Roddy McFarquhar, who was a brigadista, and interviewed him many years ago for a program I was making. Remarkable, delightful man. And had Orwell fought shoulder to shoulder with these working class Scottish comrades, I think he would have had a very, very, very different view of Scots. He would have seen that we're not all, slave owners, doughty imperialists and racists. I think, or or toffee-nosed estate owners owning miles of salmon rivers and so on. So I think he entered, his middle years with a strong, firm prejudice. And I recall in Orwell biographies, folk telling that he would cross the road rather than pass the door of the Muir's house, Edward Muir and his wife Willa. And no, Muir was a considerable poet. Willa was a considerably literate person. They translated Kafka and so on. And Orwell would not even pass their door because he disliked Scott so much. Now, you might think that perhaps the Muirs were an obnoxious couple. Not very long ago, I made a documentary about George Mackay Brown, the Orkney poet, playwright, novelist, and short story writer. George was a very quiet, shy man, heading towards possible alcoholism when he was taken up by the Muirs and given an extraordinary encouragement and affection by the Muirs. And George Mackay Brown regarded them as a wonderful couple and terrifically encouraging to young writers and to other writers. But that certainly cut no ice with George Orwell, who just decided that he didn't like them because they were Scottish. In actual fact, Muir was an Arcadian, and many Arcadians claim they're not Scottish at all. They're just Arcadians. Now, one of the extraordinary things about Orwell was, of course, that he was partly French and of Scots origin, but he made a conscious decision to become a true Englishman. And to be a true Englishman, you have to have a true English name. And what could be more English than George? It was the name of several kings, and of course the name of the patron saint. And the name of Orwell, of course, is a Suffolk river. And again, a good sounding, sensible English name. Now, the story goes that Orwell kind of chose his pen name in a rather haphazard way, kind of randomly out of several choices, some of which were clearly quite ridiculous. And frankly, I don't believe this. I don't believe that he didn't actually. I've got no evidence for this. I just don't believe it. It's sort of journalistic instinct. I think that a man who venerated Dickens, who created great names, Mr. Bumble, Scrooge, Pecksniff, Uriah Heep, novelists choose the names of their characters very carefully. I had a novel published about 10 years ago, and I had a character in it who was working class echo warrior, whom I called Matt Tyler. Now, not many people read this novel, sadly, and I'm sure that none of them actually understood that if you take the first letter of Matt Tyler, turn it upside down, you've got Wat Tyler, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt. As I say, I don't suppose any of the readers actually got this, but it really tickled me to actually have created this character with this sort of strange reference to the leader of the Peasants' Revolt. So I think Orwell would have chosen his own name, his pen name, very carefully. And we've already talked about George, about the River Orwell. The River Orwell is the only river in England where the bed of the river is not owned by the Crown Estates. It was granted to the people of Ipswich by Henry VIII. And therefore, it's a Republican river. And if Orwell did not know this, it's a remarkable coincidence that he chose Orwell, a Republican river name, for his own name. And rather than stating this, and I think why wouldn't he state it? Well, Orwell liked to riddle. He liked to litterize things. I mean, some of his writing, we know, for instance, the story of the woman poking the stick up the drain in the road to Wigan Pier, didn't quite happen that way, but it did happen, but not quite in the way he tells it. So he'll do a spin to make it actually a better read, a better piece of literature. And he also liked to slightly to mystify people a bit. I love the story. I often use it with kids. The story the riddle that Orwell tells in one of his Tribune columns. And he asks, a hunter leaves his camp, marches 4 miles south, marches 2 miles east, shoots a bear, and marches 4 miles north, returning to his camp. What color was the bear? It's a curious one until you actually start working out the geography that the bear must be white. So Orwell liked that kind of fun and teasing and playing. I remember that Richard Blair told me that when Richard Rees went to Jura to visit him, and he went for quite lengthy periods of time to visit Orwell, he would ask Orwell, what are you writing? What's this book about? And Orwell said, how many fingers am I holding up? And Richard Rees said 4, and Orwell said, could be 5. And that was as much information as he was prepared to give about what he was writing. So I think he did like to mystify people and play that kind of game. So I'm fairly convinced, although I totally admit I have no evidence that Orwell actually chose the name Orwell deliberately because it was a Republican river. One thing I do have had some evidence for was a wonderful what if. As I work in television, I'm a program maker, director, as well as being a writer, and I venerate Powell and Pressburger, two wonderful filmmakers. And in 1945, Orwell disappeared off the map. So now widely believed that he was in Jura scouting out where he would actually live. This is about September. And all he wrote, I think, all the written evidence is he wrote to T.S. Eliot saying he'd be away for the last 2 weeks in September. And he doesn't actually say where. But I know that Richard Blair believes that he was there in September of 45. And I came across evidence that in fact he did. This is in Michael Powell's, the filmmaker's autobiography. And in 45, Powell was in Argyll scouting locations for the film I Know Where I'm Going with Wendy Hiller and Roger Livesey, which is largely filmed on Mull. But he actually came over to Jura and was kind of hiking through Jura and spent a night in the house that people put him up, and then was going down to the very south of Jura to go over on the ferry to Portaskig to stay in the Portaskig Hotel where his wife was waiting for him. And they saw a cottage, and Powell remarked on this cottage with smoke coming from the window, and the person who was guiding him said, "Yeah, this is a writer called Mr. Blair, Eric Blair." And Powell said, "I know that name," because he had read Animal Farm. And had he a little more time and knocked on the door of Orwell's cottage on Jura, the cottage that Orwell was staying in on Jura, what might have happened? I mean, I think I Know Where I'm Going is a wonderful film, black and white film, but his masterpiece is Powell Pressburger's masterpiece is A Matter of Life and Death, which is a hugely ambitious and clever film. And had Orwell and Michael Powell met, Mike Powell and Pressburger have actually made a film of 1984. Orwell wrote to his agent saying that he would be quite happy if someone made a film of 1984. And I think it's one of the great what ifs, that if the two had met, if Powell had just time to knock on the door and introduce himself, there might have been some magic happen there. As it happens, we had to wait till Michael Radcliffe made his excellent version, and of course a very, very, very good BBC version as well, black and white television version, some of which was performed live on air over 2 nights. Now, one of the extraordinary things about Orwell, who was fantastically well informed, is his lack of knowledge about Scotland. He did write a book called The Lion and the Unicorn. Here it is. The lion, the symbol of England, and the unicorn, the symbol of Scotland. There's hardly a reference to Scotland in it. He just didn't know about it. I suspect because he wasn't very interested in it. There's lots and lots of things I don't know about that I should know about, but basically I'm not interested in them, so I don't. But Richard Rees told the story about leaving Glasgow for, heading to London. And they had not long pulled out of Glasgow, where Orwell looked out the window and said, well, the weather in England looks very similar to the weather in Scotland. And Richard Rees had to say, well, they're actually 60 miles from the English border. He still had the Burns country, the John Buchan country, the Walter Scott country to pass through. And it was only really when Richard Rees used these literary terms that Orwell was actually able to be able to understand the geography of where he was going to. But this changed when he arrived in Scotland. And we know how he arrived in Scotland. He wanted, after the huge excitement and success of Animal Farm, he wanted somewhere to go and write this novel that was roiling away in his head. And David Astor, whose father owned an estate on Jura, Astor still do, or some trust fund that they own, that they have still do. He suggested that they go up. Then he goes up and actually takes some fresh air and rest. And of course, it was considering the smog and dirt of London, the fresh air of Jura, and the much better food you got in Jura, because there was, lobsters and fish and venison weren't rationed on Jura ever, that he thought they would be a good place for him to go for a break. And Astor was appalled when Orwell came back with the intention of actually taking a house there and moving there. And clearly, I think Orwell, at Barnhill, he kind of established a community. His housekeeper came briefly, his son came, and his sister Averil came. And they had many, many friends arriving over the time that he was there. Richard Rees sometimes arriving for several weeks at a time to paint and to write and so on. So I think that Orwell might have thought that he was going to be kind of insulated from the Scottish population that he didn't really think very much of. But in fact, in a remote community like that, it doesn't work that way. Your neighbor might be a mile away, but he is your neighbor, or she is your neighbor. And very quickly, Orwell settled into a life and where he was treated, shyly and quietly by the name of Mr. Blair, by people who expected to be treated in the same way. He mucked in. People on Jura would cut each other's hay. If you cut my hay, I'll help you pick your potatoes. If you leave me a haunch of venison, I'll bring you some fish. A community in the post-war years, which was still very traditional, and to some extent is that way still today. So I think that Orwell was quickly charmed by his neighbours. We'd walk up to the next farm, about a mile along the road, uphill, and arrive very short of breath. At first, they thought he was very strong, silent type, not very communicative. He was just catching his breath. But he became very friendly with his neighbours, and loved Donald Darroch's sisters, Katie Darroch's scones. When a Polish serviceman with a Scots wife came, they became firm friends. And I think, in actual fact, the Polish serviceman, whose children still live on Islay and Jura, when he came with his wife was a townie. She wasn't a country girl, and she was living at the end of a track in the Inner Hebrides. And I think Averil, who was also a townie, I think they really bonded very closely. So the Rosgas and the Blairs actually had a very good relationship. I have a friend, Blair Rosga, probably named after Mr. Blair, because there's no Blair in his family history. They have a farm on Islay. And when Averil and Bill Dunn, her husband, eventually left, they apparently gave a set of chairs to members of the Rosga family, and each member of the Rosga family have a quite an ornate carved dining room chair. And any time I go and visit Blair and Margaret Rosga, I always ask permission to sit in that chair, just in the hope that some of the genius just penetrates through backside. So he found himself in this community that really worked, and somebody suggested that he liked this. He was very attracted to the idea of English anarchist communities, old-fashioned rural communities where neighbour helped the neighbour, and that's exactly what he found. On Jura. He didn't have to go to some idealistic set up, anarchist community. He actually found it among the ordinary people of Jura. Not that there weren't toffs as well. I mean, David Cameron, our Foreign Secretary, holidays there, and so on. But by and large, the people are ordinary, decent Scottish people who just try and help their neighbours and are kind and friendly towards strangers. And I saw some of this in action at the Craig House Community Hall when people were wandering around looking at these copies of 1984. One of the extraordinary things about Orwell is he started looking around and talking to people. He began to change his views on Scotland. He had always denigrated Scottish nationalists, because of that Scottish nationalist movement of Hugh MacDiarmid and Neil Gunn, and the sort of Celtic revival movement, which I think Orwell thought was pretty proto-fascist. But in actual fact, he began really to understand that there was the heather was not quite on fire in Scotland, but it was certainly smouldering. And he wrote this: "In this country, I don't think it is enough realised, I myself had no idea of it until a few years ago, that Scotland has a case against England. On economic grounds, it may not be a very strong case. In the past, certainly, we have plundered Scotland shamefully. But whether it is now true that England as a whole exploits Scotland as a whole, and that Scotland would be better off if autonomous, is another question. The point is that many Scottish people, often quite moderate in outlook, are beginning to think about autonomy and to feel they are pushed into an inferior position. They have a good deal of reason. In some areas, at any rate, Scotland is almost an occupied country. You have an English or an anglicised upper class and a Scottish working class which speaks with a markedly different accent, or even in part of the time in a different language." So this is a man who didn't know anything about the geography of Scotland, had no interest in writing about Scotland, as we see from The Lion and the Unicorn. In actual fact, is being quite prescient about what would become the rise of the devolution movement in Scotland, which eventually provided the current Scottish Parliament, and in actual fact, the whole independence movement as well. And I think he's probably the first English journalist to actually understand in the mid-40s that there was something happening in Scotland, and this was, if not dealt with, it would actually grow and grow and grow. And of course, it wasn't dealt with, and it did grow and grow and grow. And the other thing he refers to there is not only a different accent, which is the way most Scots speak, but also a different language. And he began to write about Gaelic, and he criticised the Home Service in Scotland's broadcasting in Gaelic from being amateurish and also scant. Now, Orwell knew a bit about radio programmes. He had been a radio producer during the war. And, so he was in a position to judge what a decent radio programme sounded like, which is quite extraordinary to think that maybe George Orwell, in his evening chats with his sister, Avril, over rum and milk or whatever spirits were available, might actually be listening to Gaelic radio programmes. It makes me smile. But then, of course, this is a man who spoke several languages and went to Burma and spoke several languages. So chances are that had he actually stayed in Islay or Jura, he might well have picked up some Gaelic. And if he had someone said, come on, how, he might have said, "Haguma taplet." I'm well, thank you. And I wonder if anyone knows if Orwell's library had a Gaelic dictionary. I've never been able to find out one, but I can't believe that he didn't, because he was a very capable linguist. And so he took to an interest in Gaelic, an interest in Scotland, a political interest, and also an interest in the Gaelic language. And this copy of May 1955, the 20th century, has an article by Reddy Heppenstall, who describes visiting Orwell in hospital just before his death. And Heppenstall says, when I returned to London, Orwell was in a private room with his own telephone at University College Hospital. He apologised for the grandeur. The last opinion I heard him enunciate was that whereas formerly he'd always derided attempts to preserve archaic languages like Welsh and Gaelic, he now thought such attempts worth supporting. And Orwell, I think in a letter to someone, actually talks about how well native Gaelic speakers who have learned English as a second language actually speak English. And of course, this was again prescient, because there's lots and lots of evidence now that showing that bilingualism among young people from birth is actually a huge advantage mentally, and for also your ability to learn other languages in future. So once again, Orwell, I think, saw the future in seeing the value of learning languages, even minority languages like Gaelic and English. In fact, when he's seriously ill in the sanatorium in the Cotswolds, his mind about Scots has changed quite considerably. He says here, curious effect here in the sanatorium of hearing large numbers of upper-class English voices. I have been almost out of the sound of them for 2 years, hearing them at most 1 or 2 at a time, my ears growing more and more used to working class or lower middle class Scottish voices. In the hospital at Hare Miles, for instance, I literally never heard a cultivated accent, except when I had a visitor. It was as though I was hearing these voices for the first time, and what voices? The sort of overfedness, a fatuous self-confidence, a constant baa-baaing of laughter about nothing. Above all, a sort of heaviness and richness combined with a fundamental ill will. People who one instinctively feels without ever being able to see them are the enemies of anything intelligent or sensitive or beautiful. No wonder everyone hates us so. So this is a man who described himself as an odious little snob when he was a kid, actually turning on the kind of upper class certainties that he had been brought up to. And this partly because he had been talking to much more down-to-earth, ordinary people who happened to be Scottish. Now, I'm not saying this is only Scottish people are down-to-earth and normal. If he had been in Wales or in Yorkshire or in Cornwall or any places, but it was the first time. But given that he had an anti-Scottish prejudice, this is an extraordinary turnaround for him to kind of value the views and even the accents and voices of ordinary Scottish people. Now, Quentin in the beginning said that Orwell's, I think, genius is the ability to change his mind. And for instance, in my book, I talk about the letter he wrote to Stephen Spender, whom he had described as the bisexual Spender as a pansy, and then wrote to him saying, "Well, that's because I hadn't met you. I didn't really know you as a human being. I just knew you as an idea, and basically, I'm sorry about that." And I think that is an extraordinary position, an extraordinary ability to have. And I think in a world in where there seems to be less debate. Look at America, for instance. There's pro-Trump and anti-Trump, and there doesn't seem to be much in between. And there doesn't seem to be much evidence of people shifting their views. The views seem to be completely fixed. And I think Orwell would have been completely horrified by that. And I think he would think that, an intelligent, sensitive human being should have the courage and wit to actually look at the situation and say, I was wrong about that. And now I think differently. So after I wrote my book as a huge Orwell enthusiast, and I remain an Orwell enthusiast. And in fact, I admire him, I think, even more now, because I think the overcoming of prejudice is an extraordinary achievement. I mean, you think that Orwell was born at the absolutely height of the British Empire. And if any young Brit in the early 20th century had looked at a globe of the world and seen all the pink, it would have been difficult not to believe that the Brits were somehow superior. Because they were running the world, and why else would they run the world but being superior? Well, that's we now know that not to be the case. And I think the interesting thing that Orwell wrote about 1984 is he set it deliberately in Britain, was to show that totalitarianism, the British way of life was not immune to the possibility of totalitarianism, and he wanted to write his book as a warning that was the case. Now, I don't know how long I've spoken for. Oh, long.
Spot on.
I'm a bit of an Orwell bore to some of my friends. I hope you are not of that opinion as well.
No.
But I'm very happy to take questions, as long as I'm fueled by more Ceylon orange people.
That was very stimulating. Just before I invite Peter to ask his question, I have to comment that he did have a great admiration for Bob Smiley, of course.
He did.
Who was a Scot from near Motherwell, wasn't he?
He did indeed. Yes, that was. Yeah, Smiley was certainly an exception.
Peter, good evening to you.
A great honor to meet you, Peter.
No, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. Although, of course, we're very interested nowadays in the slavery origins of the family's status and wealth. Of course, the wealth was long gone, but the status remained. But I have the impression, which may be quite wrong, that Orwell didn't worry very much about it. As far as I know, there's very little discussion in the Davison volumes and in all the documents. I don't think he talks about it very much, but I may be wrong about it. I don't have a feeling it bothered him as much as we think he should. And then the other point about the choosing of the name, I think was much more casual than you say, in the letter that he wrote, I've forgotten whether it was to his agent or to his publisher, he provided 3 pseudonyms. He said, I've forgotten the first one, and then there was one, H. Lewis Always, and George Orwell. And he said of the 3, I prefer Orwell. But it sounded to me as if, whoever Moore or Gollancz had said, oh, we think Always is better, he wouldn't have minded. So I think you're absolutely right that there couldn't be more of an English name than George, and the river is very important. But I think the selection was much more casual than you say, and also there's a famous thing that somebody said you should change your name legally, and then he said then I have to write under a different name, and of course he's buried. He remained Blair. He may remain Blair. I think in my view, the most important origin of his anti-Scottishness was his time at St. Cyprian's, where the rich Scottish kids and also the 12th of August or whatever it was, that the rich kids, even the English rich kids, their families would go shooting in Scotland. Yes. So I think the experience in St. Cyprian's, I think, was the most shaping in his anti-Scottishness. Yeah, thanks very much.
I do agree that I think that the school days, the school days were the most important. There's an age where your views are quickly formed. Yeah, I mean, I as I said, I have no evidence for my theory that about the choice of his name, but the name Always. I mean, only the name George Orwell actually would look very good in the spine of a book, I think, you know. So I still suspect, and you're right, Peter, I have no evidence of this, that in actual fact that these other names were just the ones that he was going to throw away. He'd already decided in George Orwell, and that he decided to spin a tale. You know,
three names, choose which you wish. I have a preference for Orwell, but it wasn't very powerful expressed, I don't think.
Well, you may be right, I think that if it is a coincidence that the name Orwell is a river that's a Republican river, it's a remarkable one.
Thank you. Felicia Nemo.
Am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Thank you very much. You mentioned you were honored to hear from Peter. I don't expect you to be honored to hear from plain old me, but I hope you'll answer my questions anyway. Okay, the first one is, you mentioned that you thought that in America there was not any middle ground between being pro and anti the former occupant of the White House, whose name I do not use. But it seems to me that there definitely is. A prominent example is the conservative writer Joseph Epstein, with whom I do not agree, who said that he thinks that that person is a lout and a disgusting person, but endorses his policies. And I've seen this view elsewhere. You also said something about Americans not shifting their views. But again, I know of examples, one personal friend of mine and things I've read, of people who did support that creature, but stopped after the January 6th insurrection, saying things like, that's the last straw. I would also like to ask you something that occurred to me as soon as I heard what the topic of this talk was. The main seductive villain, of course, in 1984 has a name that is not Scottish, but Irish. I wonder what significance, if any, you would like to attach to that.
Well, it's Irish. It's also Irish. It would also be a Catholic name. And of course,
he doesn't like Catholics.
He did believe that there was an element of fascism among some English Catholics. As for interestingly, I mean, I do hope you're right about the unmentionable person.
Well, I just said some. I didn't say lots.
But I actually, at the exhibition I was at on Jura a week ago yesterday, there was an American couple from Maine. Very interesting. They actually were on a yacht in the bay in Jura. They had sailed over last year to explore the coast of Ireland, and then this summer we're exploring the coast of Scotland. And he said to me, he said, this is a very obviously wealthy, he has a yacht that he can sail across the Atlantic, wealthy, intelligent man who discovered the exhibition in the afternoon and came to the official event in the evening. And he said he was appalled by the number of people that he knew who would still give the unmentionable ex-president their vote. And he was quite bemused and mystified by it. However, I do accept that it would be people who are Democrat or Republican are not 50-50. In actual fact, there's a very large number of people who are uncommitted in the middle. And, you know, let's just pray that they go, well, the way that you and I would like them to go.
There are also Republican anti-you-know-whoers, although I'm not a Republican myself, but there are some.
Right.
Never blankers, they call themselves.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Douglas, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Quentin. Hello, Les. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed your talk a great deal, and I'm very relieved to hear your story about how Orwell overcame this deplorable prejudice, even if rather late in the day. But I've got a question for you about Scottish writing and writers. You retold the story about Orwell not refusing to go past the door of Edwin and William Muir. I found that actually very upsetting to hear that story. I mean, what an opportunity missed, and for what a ridiculous reason. But I think actually it's wider than that. in your talk, when you were talking about Orwell returning from Jura, you said you gave us a bit of the literary geography of Scotland. Said he was passing through the Scotland of Burns and then of Walter Scott and of John Buchan. I thought it was very interesting. I actually have on my desk
Carlyle, of course.
this Peter Davison's volume 20, which has the big index in it. And I actually looked up Walter Scott, 2 mentions in Orwell in the entire 20 volumes, both of them for Tales of a Grandfather, which are not exactly his greatest work. Robert Burns, no mention. John Buchan, no mention. And we know that Hugh McDermott, who you touched on, of course, appears in the infamous list, but I think that's the only place. So I think in a wider sense, what an opportunity missed for Orwell. Do you agree? Or were there other Scottish writers that he did know and enjoy that you can tell us about?
Well, he certainly, when he wrote about a Dream of My Island in the Hebrides, it's actually about it's something it's been prompted by something he's read from Compton Mackenzie, which is interesting. Who had also reviewed him very favorably. I think also he was well reviewed by Naomi Mitchison as being. So I don't know how he thought about her, but she certainly reviewed him favorably. But there's an incident in where he is reviewing books for Tribune, and he gives half a dozen away to someone and says, "Here, have a look at these. They're the Scottish books. I don't think any of them are of any value." So I looked at the date that he wrote this, and then I tried to look at lists of Scottish novels, the dates of publication, and I can't see any great masterwork, being published that year. So it may well have been that the books that he gave to someone else to review weren't very good. But no, I don't think he actually did read an awful lot of Scottish literature. There was a lot of great writing at the time in English, and of course he was probably reading in French. But there wasn't. Scotland hadn't produced a Henry Miller that he might have looked up to.
I've just remembered another name, Conan Doyle. He did read.
Ah, yes. Yes.
Stevenson, I don't remember Stevenson in there. Anyway, thank you very much for your answer.
Well, he certainly missed out on Stevenson, who is a favourite of mine.
Very good. Any more questions from anybody? As everybody's being very polite about your dinner date.
Well, the hostess is always slow. So you go at 7 and you eat at 7:45.
Yeah.
So
you can have a dram.
Very good idea. Orwell, of
Good for
course,
your throat.
difficulty getting a drama in Europe because he actually writes that most of it is going to America to, I think, probably pay off our national debt for the munitions that they supplied us with during the war. But we don't have that problem on Islay now.
No.
Plenty.
Yeah, keep building new ones.
Absolutely. We're on about 10 or 11 now.
Yeah, quite something. Well, if there are no more questions, that's a very persuasive argument you presented, Les.
I have another one, Quentin. Could I ask another?
Of course, Douglas, of course.
Thank you. Just an observation, really. I think it's interesting that talking about his prejudice against the Scots, he's not prejudiced against the Scots in the usual ways. That Scots are mean with their money, they're doctrinaire Calvinists, they're against enjoyment, they're hypocritical and drunk. He goes for the upper class Scots rather than for the more vernacular failings of the Scots, I think. Would you agree?
By and large, yes, and that's certainly the prep school experience. Although I think Burmese days, I think of the McDougall, the Scottish mechanic interested only in whiskey and magnetos. I think also there's in one of the early novels, someone's on a bus. Is it Gordon Comstock's on a bus and with a Scotsman who reeks of drink, you know. So there are one or two minor references there. But I think it's, you know, Burmese days when he met some lower middle class, working class Scots who were probably getting a bit too big for their imperialist boots, lording it over the native peoples. Although I do agree that in actual fact it's the school experience that really marked him, I think.
There's a clear pattern.
I think that the idea that it happens in the great play, The Chariot, the Stag, and the Black Oil. You know, that you're a lower and servile race is one of the lines that Bill Patterson spoke. And in that case, if the Scots allow themselves to be browbeaten by the aristocracy, then maybe they are a low and servile race, and maybe it's right to despise them, you know, for not getting off their knees.
Mm. I think you illustrated it with Spender and with Smiley. Once he had a relationship with somebody, I mean, a number of people he reviewed critically and then met them, and
yes,
that's the pattern, isn't it? Give him real evidence in front of his nose, and
yes,
unlike others, he changed his mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's have more of that.
Well, indeed, we should. Can I tell you about next month? Next month we will be starting 3 hours later, because instead of having Darcy Moore get up talk to us at 3 o'clock in the morning, he's going to talk to us at 6 o'clock in the morning. Last autumn into winter, Darcy spent 5 weeks doing painstaking research in various bits of India, including where he was born, and Nainital, and archives in Lucknow and in Delhi. Absolutely, you know, fundamental research, and he's going to give us some insights that he's gained from that. So that will be at 9 o'clock next month's George Talk.
I say I saw some videos that he posted on Twitter, visiting the Orwell birth house, you know, and that's going to be a fascinating evening.
Oh, undoubtedly. Well, thank you very much indeed, Les. Look forward to seeing you in a month or so's time on Isla, your home patch, and thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. I think we should say tuning in to a broadcasting man.
Well, you're very welcome. I've really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.